What's up, guys? It's Dr. Tim Jackson with another episode of the Boss Body Podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Janine Yaniak. She is a health coach, an expert in German new medicine, and in her spare time, an attorney. So, just a little bit of an overachiever.
While I make every effort to broadcast correct information, I'm also still learning. I will double check all my facts, but realize that healthcare is a constantly changing science and art. One doctor or healthcare provider may have a different way of doing things from another. I welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. I take no money from supplement or device companies. By listening to this podcast or reading this blog, you agree not to use this podcast or blog as medical advice or to treat any medical condition in either yourself or others, including but not limited to patients that you are treating. Consult your healthcare provider for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast or the website. Under no circumstances shall any guests or contributors to the podcast or blog or any employees, associates, or affiliates of the Boss Body podcast be responsible for damages arising from use of the podcast or the blog. This blog or podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing the standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or the blog.
Welcome to the show, Janine.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, tell us a little bit about. I know you're highly educated, Ivy League educated. What you had your own health challenges, is that correct? And then you went kind of into functional medicine and studying healing modalities.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis at the age of 15, but I would say that in the grand scheme, my health issues likely started before that with OCD at the age of 5, random fainting, random vomiting, acne. But then at the age of 15, it was like full blown in every joint arthritis. And so it seemed like overnight, my world I became crippled. Like I was playing lacrosse and then I couldn't walk down the steps. I couldn't squeeze the toothpaste. And it just really, it took away my quality of life. And then I was 15 at the time. So for the next 15 years, I went mostly the medication route. And with the best doctors and the scientists and all the things. And the medication actually would work for a time until it would stop working. And so then it would be back on this cycle of it would come back with a vengeance, somehow worse than before. And then it would take about 2 years to stabilize and find a new medication. So after about 3 rounds of this, I eventually I read this book called The Plant Paradox, which is mostly about lectins. And I got the sense from that book, I'm like, oh my God, I can just heal by not eating lectins. Like, wow. And at the time, the medication was just kind of wrecking my life. So I went fully holistic for about 3.5 years. And I shouldn't even say fully holistic, but I went off the hardcore medications for arthritis. But just to function, I was taking, and this is so dumb in hindsight, but I was taking about 6 Advil and 6 Tylenol a day just to be in excruciating pain, essentially. And then at the end of that, I ended up going back on one medication to help just stabilize, essentially. And then from there, dove even deeper into the holistic stuff. So it's been a mix, I'd say, my journey of conventional and holistic. And the main driving factor was the rheumatoid arthritis, but I feel like people with autoimmune, it's never just one thing. So over the years, it was chronic hives, it was acne, it was chronic yeast infections, chronic UTIs, interstitial cystitis, shingles, kidney stones, the list just continued to grow. And so at a certain point, your list of medications is this long, and then the medications are causing a need for more medications. And so that was the situation in which I found myself and what prompted the move into the holistic space.
And was it the biologics that you took?
Yeah. It was so methotrexate, which is a chemo drug, and they put me on that first, but they were like, your case is so severe and so intense that this isn't going to work for you, and we're going to basically expedite or, jump the hurdle with insurance to get you on the
Right.
biologic ASAP. So,
Yeah.
those were the main, like a biologic with the methotrexate, with the prednisone, with the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, and then getting the cortisone injections.
Right. And how long, if you don't mind me asking, how long did you get cortisone injections?
That was mostly at the beginning of
Okay.
my journey. So I
Mhm.
had to, they like put me out to give me one in the jaw. And
Mhm.
then they did, I believe, a couple in the wrist, maybe one in the knees. There was a few.
Okay. And did you, just out of curiosity, try low dose naltrexone?
No, not at that time. It wasn't even on the radar of my doctors at all. I will
Right.
say that I did try it about a year and a half ago, and I'm trying to remember now what was happening. I think it was either super nauseous or, oh, I couldn't sleep. My sleep
Yeah.
got really messed up. So,
Yeah.
I pulled myself from it, and I haven't gone back, but it's not something that I've written off entirely.
Yeah, so when we first started, well, when it first became popular around 2008, 2009, I've been taking it since 2010, I think. I had, mold toxicity Lyme, but now just mostly take it prophylactically because it helps raise natural killer cell levels. But we used to think that you had to take it at night or it would not work. Now we know that's not true because a certain subset of people, you're one, I'm one, it will mess up your sleep. So I take mine in the morning. And so, that's something to consider. But something else that happens is most people are Th2 dominant, and low dose naltrexone causes you to switch to a more balanced Th1, Th2, and Th1 is what kills pathogens for the most part. And so, it's a recalibration of the immune system. You get some inflammatory cytokines, released when you're trying to kill these bugs. So that could also be contributing. And then the inflammation is going to disrupt sleep on top of, the downregulation of the opioid receptors at night.
Right, right. Yeah, my holistic practitioner suggested maybe we half the dose. And just at the time, I was like in between moves, I'm like, I'm just gonna put a pause on it. But it is something that I have thought about. And I think it has other benefits, like
Oh yeah.
random benefits, like blood sugar regulation, maybe.
Yeah, because what it does, inflammation, and I wrote this in the Huffington Post like 10 years ago, but inflammatory cytokines will damage insulin receptors. And
Mm,
so that will help, indirectly balance blood sugar. A lot of people, who are insulin resistant, they're working out, they're eating a healthy diet by most people's standards, but they have a lot of inflammation, for
yeah.
a multitude of reasons. But it also raises natural killer cell levels, which protects against certain immune, dysregulations. But the other thing I was going to bring up is, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, the father of functional medicine, he says that 74% of people with rheumatoid arthritis have an overgrowth of Klebsiella in the large intestines.
Right. And I know that there's been what's the name of that medication that they have used for the bacteria overgrowth in RA?
Oh, Xifaxan,
Is that what it is?
rifaximin. So yeah, that's mostly for SIBO.
Okay.
Yeah, the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. But if you do like a GI map stool test or BioMFX, they can pick up on the Klebsiella and other
Mm,
autoimmune inducing bacteria like Citrobacteria frundi. And you can use herbals like biocidin. But one thing that I just caution people against is when you do high dose, like of one herb, like oil of oregano,
mm,
it can be more decimating to your microbiome than amoxicillin. So a lot of people think, oh, it's
mhm.
natural, it's not going to damage my microbiome, but that's not true. So you can't stay on it forever.
Right.
And you have to change the terrain, the pH, because the pH changes the behavior of the bugs in the gut.
Yeah, I will say, and I mean, there's such a science to all of this. And even if you have a degree, I feel like there's always just like another door you can open, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh shit, So, but when I went holistic initially, it was just diet. And
Right.
I I feel like I went down a lot of misinformation rabbit holes. And at first, I was just like, oh, it's lectins. Now I know lectins are just like this little tiny piece, you know
Right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was working with a functional medicine doctor running all the labs, and she had me on, I think it was like 40 to 45 supplements a day.
Yeah.
And I felt terrible. But granted, I also was definitely living in mold at the time. And before this call, we were talking about the emotional piece of this.
Yeah.
And my life was just a mess. Like from the outside, it looked good.
Right.
I'm a lawyer. I had a good job. People would look and be like, oh, she's got it together. But then it's like, oh, my engagement fell apart. And now I'm like failing at work because the symptoms are so severe. I'm not sleeping. I was taking Adderall just to do my job. But it was like, I feel like I was a shell of a person. So then
Yeah.
the job piece is crumbling, and it's like across the board, nothing is regulated. You know what I
Right.
mean? So
Yeah.
I was doing all these things, but it was just, I feel like I was going nowhere.
Right.
I was like a hamster on a wheel.
Yeah.
But it started with diet. It started with all the testing and a lot of supplements and like glutathione and NAC and a binder and
Yeah.
etc. But then I went to what I would not recommend, a vegan diet.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're familiar with the medical medium, but I got sucked into that. And I'm like juicing celery and doing the fruit smoothies, and I felt terrible. And symptoms definitely worsened. But I was like, oh, it's just detox.
Yeah.
I don't think it was. Anyway, so then after that, uh, getting into parasite cleansing and mold and doing the Lyme testing, but I never started quote unquote detoxing for Lyme, because my understanding and the way that I learned is just like you start with the parasites. And I parasite cleansed for 8 months, and I got way worse doing that. And so I know for some people, they're like, oh my God, parasite cleansing, like I feel amazing. For me, that wasn't my experience. Like joint pain increased, I gained weight, like I just looked inflamed, I was inflamed. And was it because of the herbals I was taking? Yeah, I think it played a role. But I also think it was just like my body wasn't ready for that.
Right.
And like if you're in this sort of like cell danger response,
Yeah.
I don't know that it's the time to be jumping into a detox, or at least like a heavy one for 8 months.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. The cell danger response, Dr. Robert Navio, his work, all these stressors, mold, pathogens. And we were talking about Dr. Dietrich Linghart's work. In general, you address mold first, in my experience. I learned all this the hard way. Then Lyme and Bartonella and Babesia. Then you can go after parasites. But yeah, you have to kind of redox before detox, so to speak. So, if you're very inflamed, it inhibits detoxification. So they're inversely related. The more inflamed you are, the less capable you are of detoxing. And so the first step to doing anything, a lot of people say it's boosting mitochondrial function, but it's actually decreasing inflammation, because you won't be able to detox. If you can't detox, the mitochondria aren't going to work. Then you can boost the mitochondrial function. Um, but in terms of Lyme, yeah, I know you said did you grow up in New Jersey?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So obviously it's extremely common there. I mean, the reality is it's been found everywhere. I hear all the time, even a colleague messaged me a few months ago and said, hey, my wife got bitten by a tick. Who should I go to for some doxycycline? Because it does work for an acute exposure. And I said, oh, well, just go to this local guy. And the guy ended up telling him that Lyme doesn't exist in South Carolina. And I said, well, go back and ask him, does he know of ticks that can read road signs? I mean, it's just insane. It's been found everywhere but Antarctica. And so, yeah, but there's definitely an emotional component to it. And, it creates these limbic loops, right? And
Yeah.
so you get into sympathetic fight or flight mode, and you kind of have to be hypervigilant for a while for self-preservation reasons. But then, it no longer serves you. I don't have my little Boulos device, but it stimulates the vagus nerve up here. So that puts you in more of a parasympathetic mode. But talk to us about German New Medicine. What is it and how did you find it?
So German New Medicine is newer for me, but I feel like it's opened up a whole new realm. So I forget honestly how I found it. And I'm like, how did I not find it sooner on the other hand? But so it was created by this doctor in Germany who was an oncologist. He was born in the 30s, so he's now deceased, but he was originally just a regular medical doctor. And then there was this situation that occurred where his son ended up being shot. His son then went through 19 surgeries and passed away. And so after his son passed away, 3 months later, he develops testicular cancer. And he's like, there's no way that these are not related. So he does a CAT scan on his brain and he sees that there's a lesion there. And then he starts interviewing his patients with testicular cancer and ovarian cancer. And he finds that they all have experienced a significant loss prior to the onset of the cancer, and they all had a lesion in the same area of the brain. So then that's how German New Medicine originated. And he then expanded upon this and studied all the different, symptoms as small as a sneeze up to, cancer. And so German New Medicine essentially posits that all of these symptoms are the result of a conflict. And so there's two stages. There's the conflict phase and then there's the healing phase. So a conflict occurs, and while you're conflict active, essentially you're trying to resolve this conflict, perhaps, so there's something called a separation conflict where you're like, you cannot essentially access the person you want to touch, or you need to get away from them. You're like, get me out of this. So while you're conflict active, the body undergoes certain tissue changes to adapt to, and they each have a biological purpose, which I'm still learning the function of each one, but it's essentially like perhaps your nasal passageways are being thinned out so you could take in more oxygen. That's an example. So the body, while it's conflict active, is undergoing tissue changes. And then ideally you reach a resolution. And perhaps the situation is resolved. You see that person again, or in your mind, you reach a new perspective. You know what, I'm good on my own. I love myself. So there's a resolution. And once there's the resolution, the body goes into the healing phase. And that's when you will see symptoms. So arthritis or whatever it is that you're dealing with, eczema, psoriasis, those would start in the healing phase. And so when you're looking in German New Medicine, you're trying to see what was the conflict, essentially. Right. But you're not going to, say you're symptomatic, you're not going to find the issue in that moment because a resolution has occurred. So you're kind of looking at two things, what just happened that made me feel better? What just occurred that gave me relief, or, it could be really subtle, honestly. And then you want to kind of go back and it's what have I been ruminating on the past week? Right. And the whole thing is if you're ruminating about something, there's a biological purpose behind it, and your body's giving you the resources so you can solve this issue. So now I pay attention to what I'm ruminating about. But it's funny because when I look back, when I've been so symptomatic, I'm ruminating about a million things. And it's that's where, to make it short, in German New Medicine, people can become chronic with their symptoms because you essentially keep stepping on the conflict again. Right. And you just go in this loop, and that's how issues become chronic. But otherwise, they're supposed to, joint pain, I know, is supposed to last 6 to 8 weeks. So that's German New Medicine. Hopefully I explained it well enough.
So 2 stages: conflict stage and then the healing stage. So let's say I have a trauma, conflict, or an argument with someone today, whatever that may be. And that conflict stage is there. How long can it last? Okay,
so for each, it would really depend on how it manifests in your body. So each symptom has a different length of duration. But here's the other important thing with German New Medicine is that we aren't constantly developing conflicts. In order to develop a conflict, it has to be an acute event. So there's a beginning and an end. Okay. And it has to be unexpected. It has to be surprising. So you're caught off guard. And the other thing is that the emotion isn't essentially fully processed. And the way that it's often described when it's being taught is like you experience it in isolation. Like you feel as though no one else can relate to what you're feeling. And so you kind of suffer in silence.
Right.
And so one of the actual healing techniques in German new medicine is actually sharing, like breaking your silence. And
Right.
that can, if it doesn't relieve the symptoms entirely, it can help downgrade them. But
Right.
so when we're experiencing symptoms, the theory goes that these are often conflicts that were developed, like it's a single conflict that was developed whenever the first onset was. So if you're
Okay.
getting hives like frequently, it's
Right.
not that you're having a conflict each day. It's just that you're going into that same emotional state that was triggered by that original conflict.
Yeah, no, it's just I'm trying to wrap my mind around it because I know, not nearly as much as what you know. And so how did you come across it? I'm curious.
So I honestly, I think it was someone on Instagram, and I like to look at conditions, the energetic frequency behind it. And so are you familiar with Louise Hay?
Mhm.
Yeah, so I like her stuff. Sometimes I pick up her, she has this book where it's like, here's your condition, your symptom, and here's like the emotion, here's why you have it. And sometimes I find it's hit or miss. So
Right.
German New Medicine, I forget who I saw talking about it, but I was like, oh, let me go online. And the information is super limited on German New Medicine. Like it was highly gate kept.
Mm.
So there's this manual online and it's very dense. So I'm actually in a course now taking a German New Medicine course, and I'm learning so much more from that than from this manual. But if you go in the manual, I was like, let me see what rheumatoid arthritis is and like if it tracks. And arthritis is a devaluation conflict. And so if you just have it in like one joint, like maybe it's your wrist, the conflict, you want to focus on the function of that joint in particular, or say, you're dealing with an organ or whatever, you want to focus on what is the function of that organ. So so devaluation, it could be that you had a poor performance or someone scolded you or you were abused, you were humiliated. And so I was like, that's so interesting. When you have it across the whole body, it's like a
Right.
wholesale devaluation. And I'm like, I think about my existence prior to developing rheumatoid arthritis. And I'm like, my whole existence was like so devaluing. Like I grew up in somewhat of I shouldn't say somewhat, but like a verbally abusive home. And
Right.
then having instances of just like sexual assault and all of this, like everything that would lead you to be like, I am a piece of shit. Like I'm
Right.
worthless. I am like the themes of, I'll just stick with arthritis, the theme or
Yeah.
rheumatoid arthritis, like wholesale, the themes of that are like, I'm broken, I'm tainted, like it's this feeling of not being whole and not being enough, essentially. And so when I read that, I was like, jaw on the floor. I'm like, I relate to this so much. And at the same time, I feel like German New Medicine kind of has a cap or an upper limit because it's not super satisfying to be like, oh, well, every time I feel this way, my body's going to run this program.
Right.
Like who the hell wants that? It feels a little disempowering to me in a way. And so while I love German New Medicine, I also do work in like the spiritual realm. And I, in the spiritual realm, I'm not religious, but I'm in a course where I'm learning more and more about the teachings of Jesus and how he teaches essentially to plant good seed. Like the kingdom of heaven
Yeah.
is like a man who plants good seed in his field. And everyone's like, okay, that's cool, but what does that actually mean? And what he's talking about is the conscious mind planting seed in the subconscious mind. And so while I think it's super useful to pay attention, like we have to have an awareness of our thoughts, like that is what consciousness is, like developing that awareness of what you're creating. But then you also want to shift that and start planting the good seeds, because what I have found in my healing journey is that I spent like 7 years so focused on detoxing, like parasites, and I'm going to take binders, and then I'm going to get blood work for this, and then I'm going to do this diet, and then I'm going to work with this practitioner, and like I'm going to take this course. And I spent so much money, so much energy, but I was cycling in that, like planting seeds of I'm broken and I need to be fixed. And like that just goes hand in hand with German new medicine. So going back to the planting good seeds and the spiritual aspect, it's been my experience, if you just keep like pushing your attention onto what it is that you desire, naturally these traumas that are like buried come up and they reach resolution without you having to go and do, like, I did EMDR for a year and a half. And that wasn't like, I'm uncovering shit just by focusing on the good that would never come up in EMDR.
Right. Yeah. So, it would be curious, or I'm curious to know how, like, so the Akashic records, how, what you're discovering with that would interface with treatments like IV ketamine, psychedelics, under supervision of a coach or therapist who helps you process trauma.
So, I guess, well, the first with the Akashic records, I would say so if someone were to do that, they should be trained in it without any substance involved. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And spiritually, there's so many different views on this, but I do think that you can essentially blast open your auric field way too much and let in things that you're not ready to process, or I don't know how much you believe in like outside negative entities or energies, but if you are just not in a place that's super grounded, I feel like that can just like siphon an entire part of your consciousness off. And not to say you can't get it back, but that's where like plant medicine, I think, it can have its place. And also exercise caution. I know I did like a 2-day psilocybin journey, and it was my first and it was my only so far. I'm all for microdosing, but a more like a bigger event like that, I had a panic attack, and I'm like, okay, it's divine. I'm trusting in the process. I'm seeing what I need to see, but it was just really intense for my system. And then but as far as the Akashic records, so the Akashic records, I guess for anyone who doesn't know, is your soul's records. And you can also access like the galactic records, which I'm still learning about, but you would essentially do a reading for someone, and you would go in, you would open their records. It's almost like it's like a file of their soul's history. And you can see, whatever they come into the session with, like, hey, I'm having some money issues, or I'm having some health issues. What might come up is an inner child thing is presenting itself. Like I might actually see like, okay, I'm seeing you at 7 years old and she's saying this, or it might be a past life. So I recently had a reading and a past life came up immediately, and it was impacting me in this lifetime. And so, I mean, some people may not believe in that, but from what I have seen in those records, it's really interesting. Yes, you can absolutely use them for healing. Like I had been doing a carnivore diet, and I went into the records and they're showing me eating all these other foods. And they're like, this is where you're going. And I'm like, oh, that actually really resonates. And it wasn't on my radar at all until you showed me. So like, that's one example of how I've been using them. But I've never like I'll microdose, but I've never done it under the influence of any other medication. And I think if someone, or medication, I don't know if that's the word, but if someone were to do that, I feel like they would have to be like highly trained in it first, or they receive whatever it is that they're taking, and they have someone do a reading on them. But you'd have to like really trust that person, in my opinion.
So when you say open someone's Akashic records, can you expand upon that? Might be a silly question, but
no,
what does that mean?
Yeah, so I guess, do you meditate?
I do.
So the way I see it is I just go into meditation. I drop in, essentially, I feel like I drop into my body, drop into my presence, essentially. I call my energy back from all dimensions, space and times. I protect myself, I shield myself, and set the intention to, if it's my records, like connect with my own records, or it could be connecting with your records if I'm doing a record for a reading for you. And it's like everyone gets guidance in different ways. So for me, it's just like all of a sudden I feel as though I have entered your field in a sense. And I just start getting information downloads about, he needs to work on this, or he needs to look at this block is coming up. And so people see, feel, experience it differently. Like there's clairvoyance, there's clairaudience, there's all these. I mean, I believe humans are highly multi-dimensional technology. Like we are the most advanced technology that we have, and we forget that.
Right.
And we're on this dense earth in this lifetime, and our senses, which are so far beyond our five senses, can get dulled. But we all have
Right.
these, I mean, telepathic abilities and these abilities to sense and know information. So the Akashic records are essentially just like, it's like a library of information, and you could just tap in and all of a sudden you know something that, like,
Right.
technically maybe you would have no reason to know it, but now you know it. So
Right.
if I were to access your records, the way I actually see it is very literal. Like it's almost funny. Like I see a big book opening up, but
Right.
I don't think everyone else sees it that way, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, to your point, I think that there's probably an energetic frequency connected to the records. I mean, based on my very, very limited knowledge. And the frequency medicine I think is cool. It's something I don't know a ton about, but bioresonance, biofeedback, I think those are good. There's a device called Evox. A colleague of
Evox.
mine who's a naturopath and a nurse has it, and she has software, and she's looking at her laptop, and she'll have you speak into a microphone, and you'll go through different family members, different people in your life, and it picks up on the frequencies. And like she knew nothing about my family and people in my life, but she was spot on, like scarily spot on in her assessment. And so I know that's totally different than the Akashic
Yeah.
records. But I think I mean, it just speaks to, like, yeah, I'm great with the biochemistry, but our biophysics, like non-native EMFs, our environment control our biochemistry to a large degree. And then there's the aura. There's so many layers to it. It's not just like, okay, you have this symptom, you take this, you have this symptom, you take that. And that's why the opt-in on my website is called Beyond Green Allopathy, because if you go to someone and they say, oh, Janine, you're on 14 medications, I got you, I'm going to put you on 27 supplements. Well, in the short term, like, I would say up to 10, maybe even 12 supplements may be appropriate, but not 27. That's way
Mm-hmm.
too many. And so that's where, that's not true functional medicine. That's not getting to the root cause.
No.
Now, at the same time, we don't want people suffering. So we need to do things to address the acute symptoms, but if and only if we're working on eradicating the root causes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that.
And so in terms of the Akashic records, how do they train you to access them? Like in terms of opening up the book?
So it's funny because, and I'm in a class right now with a woman who's highly skilled at this, but you could even like read a book on it. But she was essentially saying, and I know this is true, it's like you have already been accessing the records. Like if the fact that you're here, you've been in the records. And when I went in, like the way that she trained me to, I'm like, oh, I've been here before. And I think people have different ways of just teaching this. Like the Akashic records are just, I feel like they can give you access to more information than you would get if you just set the intention to tap into somebody's field. So like right now, and I'm not trained in Reiki. It's not something that like speaks to me personally at this moment, but maybe you never know.
Right.
There's another modality that I've been learning, and I actually think it was created by what's his first name? Something Silva.
Oh, The Silva method.
Yeah, but I think, isn't that a manifestation method?
I think it's more of it could be a manifestation method. I learned about it through Mind Valley.
Okay,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, he talks about it a lot in terms of, yeah, I think there's a manifestation component to it for sure.
Yeah, I remember seeing some woman who's like, I win every prize that I desire. But anyway, so there's this method. Apparently he founded it. I'm not going through Mind Valley or anything, but where you essentially, whoever you're working on, you invite them into, you create a space. Essentially, you create a space in your mind. I guess we could call it that, your imagination, and you invite this person who you're working on to come up into the space. And I've done this before, and it's like I don't know if you want to call it your spirit guides or your intuition or whatever, but it's sometimes a little cryptic, and you've got to learn how they're communicating with you. But I'll practice on people who I don't know, who I know nothing about, and my instructor, whatever you want to call her, she'll give me people to practice on. And it's like suddenly I know, and they give their consent, but I know things about them that like I've never met them before, and that's similar to the Akashic Records, but I just think the Akashic Records opens it up more. But when these people come in, it's like I see them on a table and I start scanning their system. Like I'll scan their skeletal system. I'll start scanning their skin, and just like usually I'm brought to a specific area that's needing attention. And then what you're doing is you're seeing them whole, and you're trying to resolve like the issue that is coming up at the time. And so I find that there's so many other ways to work on people than just the physical is a big piece, and then there's also the energetic slash spiritual slash emotion. And I'm not sure if are you familiar with emotion code?
Mm-hmm.
So I found emotion code to be amazing. I've been doing it on my pet, and he's had like some traumas recently, and he became like a different cat overnight. So I
Oh,
think
wow.
people sleep on these things that seem a little more woo woo. And
Yeah.
in my experience, I feel like they've been some of the more monumental shifts for me personally.
There's a guy, his name is Dr. Larry Dossi. I think he's still alive. He's an ER doctor, Vietnam veteran, but they did this study where they prayed for a certain half of the patients in the emergency room,
Oh
and
yeah.
the other half they did not pray for. And the outcomes were statistically significantly better for the people who were prayed for,
Yeah.
which I
I
think, kind of speaks to what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, I've heard anecdotes of people that were misdiagnosed in some fashion and then they pass away. And it was like, or people who actually have cancer and they just decide, like, I'm going to live my life, and they do, and they have no, they're fine. And
Right.
then there's this book. Have you read that book, Dying to Be Me? It's by
Huh.
like Anita Morjani, I believe. And that's like I love that book. So she developed, I don't want to misspeak, but I think it was stage 4
Okay.
cancer. And she got to the point where she had like lumps the size of lemons around her thyroid. And she had a near-death experience and essentially woke up during that near-death experience to the truth of like how whole we already are. And the
Mhm.
cancer just dissolved essentially overnight, and the doctors are like, what the, we
Right.
can't describe this. They still want to do chemo on her, all the things. So there's just so many, and I know that example is a little different, but I just feel like brain retraining and
Yeah.
this remembrance is such
Right.
a huge piece of healing. And I feel that's what was missing for me while I was, on my holistic journey with this narrative of I'm broken and I need to fix myself.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we essentially have these tapes playing 24/7 in our mind. And there's a good book called Psycho-Cybernetics. Have you heard of it?
What was it?
Psycho-Cybernetics, like
No.
Cybernetics. It's by a guy named Dr. Maxwell Maltz, who I think has passed away, but he was a plastic surgeon. And what he noticed was that the people who, physically he got the best outcomes with, a lot of times they were the least happy with their results, even though he exceeded their expectations, because they still perceived themselves in their mind's eye, their third eye, to have, this quote unquote defect or this imbalance. And the people that he got, so outcomes with, they oftentimes were the happiest because they perceived themselves as being, significantly better, or their appearance was better.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, completely.
And so, in terms of German new medicine, so we talked about what it is. What are the quote unquote treatments or therapies involved with it?
That's where German New Medicine, I think, is a little limited because it's the focus of GNM is really like what caused this. But
Mhm.
in discovering what caused this, I find there's so much power in the awareness that people just realizing, oh shit, this is what's been creating this symptom in my body. They've had experiences where the symptoms have just dissolved, like on the
Right.
spot. So, but GNM essentially is like you need to reach a resolution with it. Like once you find what the conflict is, like say we're gonna, okay, bladder issues, because that's something I like, recurring UTIs and interstitial cystitis. The bladder is linked to marking conflict, like a territory conflict. And in men, it often manifests as like a physical marking, like this is my lawn and that's my neighbor's lawn and he's crossing into my territory. Whereas for women, it can be more of like, oh, I don't know where we stand in the relationship, or like needing clarity on boundaries maybe in a relationship. And so just understanding like that alone, just realizing like I'll give one anecdote. This woman realized, oh my God, every time my mom comes in my room and like interrupts my phone call, I get a UTI. She realizes that now she can see it, UTI is gone. And
Wow.
so for me, I'm still digging at like why I was dealing with interstitial cystitis.
Mhm.
But here's where it all like kind of like melds together. I feel like everything has a place and
Right.
nothing is like the end all be all. But I was
Sure.
sitting in meditation the other day. I did like a root chakra meditation and a sacral meditation. So I'm in that energy, right? And I leave the meditation. I'm like, okay, cool. Like I did that clearing. All of a sudden I get this download of information and it takes me back to this like memory that I can't even actually remember. Like I'm like, is this actually true? But I'm trusting that it's true. And
Right.
it was where we were going somewhere. I was really little, and my parents like were like, you have to pee before we go. Like you have to go before you leave the house, or else you might not be able to go. And then something happened. We're in the car. I have to go. Now I'm in trouble. I think I ended up having to pee in like a little like water bottle. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then I'm like, holy shit, because I have had this narrative like my entire life where I'm always looking for the bathroom. Everywhere I go, I'm like, well, I better go to the bathroom now because what if there's not going to be a bathroom? And once I realized that, I haven't had any symptoms. So, and I guess German New Medicine would say, yeah, that is a territory because you're looking like where you can go essentially. But I'm like,
Right.
how silly in a way, like and stupid, like this little thing. That's the thing with German New Medicine. They're like, it's often not your big traumas that cause these symptoms, because often when you have these big traumas, you go and you talk about it, you seek support, you're with family, or you get a therapist, or you're praying, you go to the priest, whatever. But something so in like I'm going to call it insignificant and small as my parents
Right.
telling me to go pee before we go, you know what I mean? Like
Right.
that's not something that you're seeking help for. So that is in a sense, it's like the trifles that are more likely to lodge in the body.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I had a psychologist tell me one time that she's not concerned about the people who are going through big traumas, because typically, family, friends will rally around them when they perceive it to be a big trauma. But trauma can be something as simple as not having your emotional needs met.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times we think, oh, trauma, you're, having the crap beaten out of you. But yeah, that's trauma. But there's many other forms of trauma. And I'm more concerned about the more subtle forms because people don't perceive it as trauma. and then it accumulates and accumulates and accumulates. And like we were talking about before we started recording, like Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt says, for every level of physical toxicity, there's at least 1 or 2 levels of emotional toxicity.
Yeah. Yeah, well, as you were saying that, it reminded me, I did a whole stint of nervous system regulation, and a lot of that was like orienting, like when you sit in your seat, put your feet on the floor, look around, like, touch your legs, getting your body essentially, and just like allowing yourself whatever wants to come up. And then if it's too intense, you resource, maybe you get a cup of tea. So a lot of that just like getting into the body and allowing things to come up. But a lot of the trauma that they were talking about in those courses that I took was like you were a baby and you were crying and your dad didn't come in the bedroom. You know what I mean? And I'm
Right.
like, things that are totally beyond our awareness at this point in time. And also, I'm like, my dad definitely did that. Like, he talks about it still. He's like, yeah, you were crying. And I'd be like, oh, girlfriend, you could figure it out. I'm like, that's lovely. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. Dr. Gabor Mate,
Mm-hmm.
the trauma expert, he talks about learned helplessness, the concept
Yeah.
in psychology. But when you allow, and I just saw this on a TV show last night, when you allow a baby just to sit there and cry, yeah, they'll stop crying, but it's because they essentially give up. And then later on in life, when they face adversity, their first response is, I'm going to give up. It's learned helplessness. And so I think we have to revisit a lot of our, parenting techniques, because people will say, oh, yeah, I did this and that, and my kids turned out just fine. And then, you talk to the child and they're like, oh, yeah, I've been in therapy for 15 years.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's almost as if your needs aren't being met, so you shut down, like just
Yeah.
a nervous system shutdown.
Yeah. It's like that dorsal vagal freeze response where
Yeah.
you're just kind of sitting there, you don't do anything. Which, we talked about the Hulis device that I have that you just apply, below the left earlobe to stimulate the vagus nerve, and that helps to increase parasympathetic tone, and it activates the ventral vagal, which is, social engagement system. So you're going out, meeting people, interacting, participating in life. So I think that definitely plays, a role in terms of stimulating the autonomic nervous system. The other thing is tongue tie. I know that sounds
Yeah.
crazy, but I've mentioned this a lot because this book, 6 Foot Tiger, 3 Foot Cage. So we don't get breastfed for long enough, and we don't chew hard foods as much. So our jaw width is decreased, and that decreases the amount of space the tongue has. And the tongue, um, the resting position should be on the roof of the mouth, and that helps to kind of balance the autonomic nervous system. And so tongue tie, a lot of times ENTs miss it. Airway centric dentists, in my experience, are the best at picking up on it. And now the treatment, I have a tongue tie. I have to do some myofunctional therapy and have it released, but it's non-ablative. So there's no downtime. It's just a laser to the frenulum. And, that plays a major role because there's a fascial slip that goes all the way down to the base of the lumbar, even sacral spine. And the dentist I see, she said when she releases it for people, especially other healthcare providers, they're like, oh, all the tightness and stiffness in my cervical and thoracic lumbar spine just went away.
Wow. That's so,
Yeah.
I've never looked into the tongue tie at all. As you're saying that, I'm thinking, I'm like, my tongue's on the roof of my mouth. So maybe that's a good thing, but
Yeah.
I haven't personally gone into the tongue tie. I did do the holistic dentist because
Mhm.
or biological dentist. I'm like, I'm convinced there's got to be like a massive cavity and that's what caused all of this. And he was like, actually, you're fine. So
Yeah.
that was kind of a dead end for me, but always good to go, and find
Yeah.
out. But as far as like when you're talking about the spine and release there, another thing that I actually found helpful was craniosacral
Hmm.
therapy. And
Hmm.
the guy who I went to a few people, but one of the guys, he also does a form of like fascia release with it.
Uh-huh.
So he had, I mean, most of the session was me with my legs above my head, and he's like doing this deep stretch, and it just, I don't know what it did, but it felt like just years of this tension was releasing.
Yeah. And, I'm not an expert in this area, but it comes down to the piezoelectric current, like in
Mm-hmm.
our bones and in our fascia. And I did a active release technique. It's a soft tissue release technique. Every NFL team has an ART provider. but I did the spine certification in 2011. There's a guy in my course who had done another fascial release technique course, and he was working on me. And he said, when he went through the course, started crying like right in the middle. And at first, I thought it was hocus pocus. But then, as I started to learn more and talk to more colleagues, they were like, "No, there's definitely something there in terms of it getting stored um,
Yeah.
and releasing the fascia." Because when you dissect a cadaver, the first thing you see is not muscle; it's fascia. That's why
Mhm.
your right glute, left cheek is connected to your left shoulder, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So if you like in baseball pitchers, if you have inhibited left glute, they'll typically have right shoulder problems. And so that's where the kinetic chain and looking beyond this, okay, I got knee pain, I'm going to treat the knee. Because usually the hip and ankle, if those are imbalanced, that's going to lead to extra stress on the knee. And if you look at like NBA players, when they started wearing those really high top shoes, the incidence of knee injuries went through the roof because the ankle is meant to be a joint of mobility. And when
Mm.
you limit the mobility, then it puts the mobility on the knee, which should be stable in the medial lateral plane, the frontal plane, and it becomes unstable there.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. And so, in terms of the Akashic records, how do you see incorporating that with the German New Medicine? Do you see finding the conflict with the German New Medicine and then addressing it with the Akashic records?
So I'm not offering Akashic record readings yet to any of my clients, but what I can say is I will go in and ask, what do I need to be shown about this client? And I'll get a download. And it's so fun. Like, I'll give an example. The other day, I had someone who I was like, what do I need to be shown about this client? And I saw her as a baby being like, and this was actually before I knew about the separation conflict in German New Medicine, but I saw her being
Mhm.
separated from her mom. And it felt really young to me. And she has eczema. So I was like, I don't know why, but I'm just seeing you being pulled away. And I'm also hearing like something with not receiving enough breast milk, number one. But I'm seeing the separation. She's like, oh my God, yes. When I was born, I was like, they separated me from my mom because I was sick and I had to be in the, whatever unit. And then I go on German New Medicine and it's like, that's a common trigger for eczema. And then it just
Right.
like, like my mind started to like, I feel like in one way or another, you end up connecting the pieces. So, and it's funny because just on that story with when I was like, oh my God, she was separated from her mom. I look it up, separation conflict makes
Mhm.
sense. And then I remember I did once date this guy who had a daughter or has a daughter, and she was getting eczema all the time. And this was when her parents started doing a new custody arrangement. So her time was
Mhm.
being split between them. And it was like she just kept getting these full body like eczema rashes. And I'm like, makes so much sense now knowing German New Medicine. But back then I didn't have the tool. But I
Right.
guess to answer your question, I see myself essentially. I mean, now I'm just knowing the German New Medicine, so I feel like
Mhm.
my mind goes to it automatically, and I think it'll be easier going into the records, making sense of what I'm seeing. Whereas before, I was kind of going in blind.
Right. Absolutely. And so, what's something that you know today, because you've been on quite the journey, that you wish you would have known, say, at the beginning of your journey?
Okay, this seems probably two things. I would say your beliefs matter so much more than like than you could ever give credit for. I really believe that nothing shows up on the body unless there is a match in the subconscious mind. And then the other thing I would say is don't stop taking your medication, because I think it's really easy in this space, in this healing space, to be exposed to so many people who are like, that medication is trash.
Yeah.
Doctors are evil. Pharma is evil. And people go off their medication like me and then go through years of hell and suffering when it's not necessary. And
Right.
also, like, I think the question is getting back to the subconscious, like, where do your beliefs stand right now? Because if your beliefs stand in I need medication, then you're fighting an uphill battle trying to go off medication. Like, if your belief is, oh my God, my case is so severe that diet alone won't work for me, then why
Right.
would you do diet alone? Like, this is me, that was my lesson. So if I could go, and I have so many people actually who reach out to me, they're like, I have so much guilt and shame about taking medication and I feel like I'm not healed because I'm still on it. And it's like, actually, in my opinion, you can be healed full and complete, even with the medication, because at the end of the day, I feel like we're talking about an energy, and like healing is wholeness. And you're able, like, why do you want to be healed? You want to be healed so you can enjoy your life and live. And if you're doing that, it doesn't matter whether the medication is there or not. Like, and
Right.
eventually the medication will shift out, but it should
Right.
feel more of like oh, I'm ready for this. Like, this feels
Right.
expansive. Like, it might feel a little
Right.
stretchy. I'm a little nervous, but I feel
Right.
like this is the right thing, as opposed to like, oh my God, this influencer online told me that it's going to steal all my calcium and kill me. Like, that's not
Yeah.
the move?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think I hear people all the time say, oh, I'm on this medication. I'm going to stop. I read this. And I'm like, well, you have to address the reasons why you needed the medication in the first place. So, if you're on an antidepressant, you can't just stop it. It's a bad idea. You have to address, heavy metal toxicity, mold, pathogens, gut dysbiosis, subconscious beliefs, trauma, and then you can likely come off of it with the permission of your prescriber, because most medications were studied for short-term use and not really long-term use. But
Mhm.
if you don't put those pillars of support in place and you just stop it, you're going to be in a state of suffering.
Oh yeah, big time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the lesson I learned the hard way. And I'm like, anyone who comes to me, I'm like, don't do that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of shame around it. And, again, it goes back to, are you working towards, a state of balance and homeostasis? Now, if you're sitting on the couch eating Twinkies all day and watching TV and popping medication, that's a different conversation. But if you're,
Hmm.
making progress every week, every month, then I think you're headed in the right direction.
Right. I would say combine the two. I think
Yeah.
it's really easy to get in this black and white space of like, it has to be all conventional or it has to be all holistic, when
Right.
I think you can reframe and be like, they're both tools, and I can weave them both in as needed. But
Yeah.
I would never say just do medication. And I would never
Right.
say, if you're not ready for just holistic, don't do just that.
Right. Right. Absolutely. So we're going to put your links up, but where can people find you?
Uh, I am mainly right now just on Instagram, and it's naturally Neen. So ITS, naturally Neen.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thanks for sharing your experience and your inspiring story. And hopefully we can have you back on in the future for some more updates, because it seems like you're going to continue to learn.
Yep, for sure. Thank you so much for having me. This is so enjoyable.
Absolutely. Well, have a blessed day. Thank you so
You
much.
too. You too.